Hello and welcome back to Processing the Process, where we capture and discuss the technical, psychological, and contextual dynamics that shape the process of creating a work of art.
Yes.
Week by week, moment by moment, we are following Jonathan Riddell, choreographer and artistic director of Riddell Dance Theater, as he creates his latest works for RDT's Second Story Dance Project. Today we'll focus on Second Story's 72nd rehearsal,
Yes.
Big Sigh, which took place on April 25th, 2018. Now, when we first started Second Story, the atmosphere in the studio was pretty relaxed, somewhat laissez-faire, and relatively unstructured, if you would agree, John. Interestingly, what I've been noticing recently is that either the night before rehearsal or the morning of, Jonathan's been sending texts to the group outlining a broad strokes idea of his vision for the way that particular rehearsal might be structured. Now, John, this is a pretty big change from that laissez-faire, unstructured, early days when I think our idea was, wow, we're just kind of lucky enough to
We're
even
just happy to be
there,
here.
considering that all of our children are there. But I was wondering what you were thinking now that you're introducing an organizational element like this into the process.
Yeah. Well, I definitely felt like we were capable of accomplishing more if we had a bit more structure. Sometimes that structure blows right up, and any best laid plans, and they just
Absolutely.
explode. But if we at least had a loose goal, and we were all kind of on the same page of what we were trying to get done that day, that indeed it started to work. It started to be the right time for that. I think in the beginning we had to let things be just sort of free for all,
Right.
and just very spontaneous. And what do you feel like doing right now? Oh, then
Sounds good.
here come some kids running around. Let's break from that and shift over to something else.
Right.
And as we were sort of figuring out the lay of the land, we needed that. Once we sort of knew what was possible, what kind of worked, what dynamics worked, then we could start to think about, okay, so we know, you start to learn things like, okay, in the very beginning, it's good to let the kids run, but then they will settle down, and that's when we can get work done, for example. Or sometimes it's the opposite. But so yeah, a better organization was possible. I think the other thing was we started to become more ambitious. We started to want to
Good point.
accomplish a few more things. We knew we wanted to start doing showings of the work, and that just can't be done without some structure. I felt like, just introducing it by either the night before or the morning of, saying, hey, so, we're all going to show up. We're going to try and warm up within 30 minutes or 45 minutes. And then, maybe I'll start with my piece, and then we'll get a run in, and then we can transition over to Mandy's piece, to Lori's piece, just so people could start having their heads in the game, even while the chaos was going on. And we're not then having those moments of either an enforced pause in the momentum from something happening with a child or our own needs, or a natural pause because maybe we naturally finished one section of the rehearsal, but then we stare at each other for a few minutes and go, well, what are we going to do next? Any professional dance rehearsal is going to have
Absolutely.
a schedule and a structure, and the dancers are going to know that coming in. So that was us starting to be able to embrace some of that again.
Well, today this rehearsal was no exception. John had outlined a plan that included the rehearsal of your piece, Brittle Branches.
Yes.
Now, almost all of the pieces, if not all, that we presented at our Works in Progress showing on March 18th will be featured again in our next collaborative endeavor with the Mamaroneck Council of the Arts in the fall, hopefully in September. And certainly Brittle Branches will be one of the pieces that will be performed. So that led me to wonder, in order to maintain the technical and artistic quality level that you have already achieved, if not surpass it, and have that level sustained or surpassed for the Arts Council show, what is that going to require in terms of rehearsals between now and September? Now, for our colleagues at home, keep in mind that all we have, generally speaking, is one time a week to rehearse.
Yes.
I just made you nervous.
I know, yes. We try and get a lot done in that one rehearsal. And yet it seems like we just crawl. But what will that take? Well, let's back up a little bit, because we did our showing and it was great and the piece looked great. It definitely was still in, is still in a somewhat raw state. It was the first time we'd performed the whole thing completely.
Yes.
And there's still a lot of refinement work to do. But right after the showing, we then moved right into our first children's workshop and had to take a couple weeks to prepare that and then to execute that. And so this was our first rehearsal really back from that. And I suddenly found it, even though creatively I was already moving on to my next work and thinking about other projects that could involve us in the future, all of a sudden it clicked. I was like, we really need to touch back on these pieces that we, performed and showed, but suddenly we're slipping away from us. So it definitely was time to go, hey guys, remember that work? Let's run it 2 or 3 times, I think we did, and indeed touch base, and the dancers were definitely appreciative.
Do you think you will need, for example, to run Brittle Branches once every rehearsal till the fall?
I would like to. I don't think it would, if we missed a week, I think we'd be fine, we'd recover, but it's a piece that I want to really refine. I think it's deserving of that, and the dancers want to refine their roles in the work.
Yes.
So it certainly deserves that, and could really just be stunning the more we do that. So I would like that, but I think if we set that as a goal and then accidents come along and scheduling conflicts come along and it has to fall by the wayside once a month or twice a month, we'll then still be okay in September. Yeah.
Well, then here we are coming into rehearsal with an agenda, but of course beyond that we have no idea what's actually going to happen and how it will play out. So in this particular rehearsal, Mandy and Jonathan had arrived first and begun to stretch, and lo and behold, in comes Lorena and Sebastian with a surprise guest. Lorena's husband.
Yes,
who
thank
was,
you, Jose.
Yes, it was just a treat, and he was off from work and helped Lorena to navigate a bit because they had just moved, and this was the first time commuting to rehearsal from their new home. And Lorena looked pretty stressed out because apparently it was still during rush hour and it took a lot of time. And of course, Lorena does not want to be late for rehearsal. She's looking stressed out. But in contrast, Sebastian is
Cloud nine.
elated. Why? Because Dad's home from work and decided to come to rehearsal. So now he has Mom and Dad, which this is just pure elation. And he can't wait to show Dad his favorite things like the hallway and the lounge with the toys. But most of all, he has to show him how he runs across the floor with his stroller and goes bang, 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 bang. This for him is the highlight, and there's not much that can really beat that. Well,
no matter what else is going on.
Absolutely.
In other dancers or anything like that. Yes.
Which we will get to in a moment.
Yeah.
You'll see what that's like. Jonathan and Mandy took turns leading the warm-up while Lorena was next to them doing stretches on the floor because she still wasn't feeling 100%. And as she moved to the bar to continue, Jonathan and Mandy start what we call their across the floor segment. Now, I have been dying to ask John this question. I don't know why I haven't before, but if you looked at the two of them, but particularly Jonathan, you would see this tremendous ear-to-ear grin, just big splitting smile. So Jonathan, what about the across the floor segment gives you such pleasure?
I mean, we get to really dance. We get to fly across the room. We don't get that very often, at least anymore, so I can't help it. It's just, we get to run and leap and do wacky things.
Right.
It's just fun. But you're right, like I don't even know if I realize I'm having that much fun. It just is that much fun.
Yeah, you look completely free.
I don't always feel that way, but yes. But, yeah.
You do. Yeah. Well, after you're across the floor, Lorena needed still a little bit more time to feel well enough to begin to rehearse. So Jonathan returned to working just a little bit on the choreography he had begun to create last week and had begun to teach Mandy. So once again, he and Mandy began to work on this particular piece. Now, I found this very interesting because the work, as we described it actually in videocast number 1, is a new piece that will be part of a series of 5 works that John will be creating based on themes of loss and grief. So I know that you're going to be performing this new work as a solo, and yet here you are teaching the choreography to Mandy and then dancing it together. So I'm wondering, what do you find helpful at this stage about doing that?
A couple things. I first thought of teaching Mandy that material simply because we were needing some material to dance as an exercise in class, sort of at the end of our class session. And it sort of felt like, oh, well, this is simply good movement to work on as an exercise. Taking it out of context, removing the subject matter, the themes of loss, just as abstract movement. It was appropriate for what we needed for our bodies. And once we did it one time, it then felt good to revisit it and add on a little bit more. So that's why we continued with it. Then it also serves me as a choreographer to be able to teach the movement to someone else, to see what it looks like on them. As you teach things, you learn them better for yourself. You go a little bit deeper in your knowledge. It's no longer abstract, slightly fuzzy notions in your mind. It becomes very concrete because you have to then deliver that material to another person. So it's a great way for me to analyze the material more as well. So I'm very grateful that Mandy was open to that and enjoyed doing it and wanted to do it again. So I think that's all important to the choreographic process.
Makes a lot of sense. And speaking of analysis, when they were finished with the Across the Floor segment, it was time then to begin work on Brittle Branches.
Right.
Now, Mandy and Lorena were ready to dive right in, even though they had not performed it since the showing. And they were bound to be...
about a month ago.
Yeah.
It was over a month ago.
Exactly. And rather than review it verbally, they said, no, let's just give it a shot. And there's John sitting back against the mirror with his pad and pen, and he's about to take notes. And again, I've always wanted to ask this question too, and I now have the opportunity. John, as you settle in this rehearsal to watch the ladies run through Brittle Branches and take notes, what are your objectives? What are you planning to focus on, and why?
Well, I think it depends on the rehearsal, and it depends on when in the process of creating the piece or rehearsing the piece you are at. In this particular case, I knew that we hadn't touched it in over a month, and we were just going to throw on the music, and they were going to do their best, and mistakes may happen, but sometimes that's the best way to just remember the pieces. Put on the music, do your best, and then you know what you don't know.
Right.
Which is sort of what they did. But I had two choices. One, I could just turn away and let them do that, or I could take the opportunity to indeed take notes, but with a grain of salt, because I know that it's not going to be the best run. There will probably be some, mental blocks or little foibles here and there, but
Sure.
But I can address things that maybe I've been meaning to address, or oh yeah, that mistake, it keeps coming up, so let's address it, that kind of a thing, or this little nuance I've always been meaning to look at. So I was like, let me do some notes and I'll throw them at them and it'll be fine. And I think it was nice because it became very efficient. They actually felt good about the run. They were like, well, for a month away from it, that was pretty good. So yeah, we're ready to hear some notes. I think sometimes I remember as a dancer, I would say, you know what, please don't give me any notes because I have so many of my own just from running
and it'll be on overload.
I have so many notes. Can I just run it again and add my own notes, and then you tell me what you thought? But they said, you know what, give us your notes. We went through a page or two of them, got a lot of information out, and then they said, great, let's run it again. They were so excited. I thought I maybe had exhausted them with all those notes, but they were so excited, and they were like, no, let's do it again. So that way we can remember everything you just said, and you can give us even more. It wound up being, wildly productive in terms of cleaning up the piece, and unexpected, because I was like, well, we'll just throw it on as long as they remember the steps. We're ahead of the game then, but we got a lot more.
Exactly. And speaking of unexpected, even though by now we kind of should expect this, but right in the middle of the run-through.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Sebastian bounds into the room and hugs Lorena's legs, and he's begging for hugs and kisses, and I'm laughing because his timing is impeccable, because this is just right before the moment when Lorena has her solo segment in Brittle Branches. So she's able to disentangle herself sort of right before she has to go on and do this. You just can't make this up. But this is really a classic second story scenario in which you're focused on your work and then your concentration is broken either by your own child or by one of your colleagues' children. Now, I imagine that you and Lori and Mandy could react in any number of ways to this kind of interruption. So I'd like to ask you a number of questions about this dynamic because, after all, juggling creating and caregiving roles is central to what we do. It's really the hallmark of Second Story. So I think that, John, our colleagues are really interested in knowing how we really pull this off.
Yeah.
So I actually have 4 questions for John about this, and I won't overload him by asking them up front. I'll do it one at a time,
Thank
John.
you. Thank
Okay.
you.
So first, what are some of the typical feelings that emerge when you're working and then distracted by the kids?
It runs the gamut. I think, well, let's talk historically for a minute. I think in the beginning of this project, it was a lot more frustrating. I think because we simply weren't as used to it. We didn't really know what was going to come of this project, and again, we were so connected to our old ways of working, which would involve no distractions, really. And now we have a ton of them, and they just come. So it used to be very aggravating. And even though you knew it was no one's fault, and you were trying not to get frustrated, man, it would be frustrating. And it would be with my own kids, with their kids. It didn't matter. It's you're trying to think of this beautiful, nuanced moment or this idea, and then suddenly just someone screams in your face and erases all the brain work that you've just done. Or they need you, or they run and cling to you while you're trying to move. It's incredibly frustrating. Now we're a year and a half in, or almost nearing 2 years in.
Yes.
I think we have a much better rhythm, a much better understanding of the dynamic, and experience and evidence that we can still get work done even with these distractions. I know now, I really just laugh it off, and I'm much more trusting of myself to know, even if I'm distracted in the middle of trying to come up with an idea, I still will come up with the idea. It's just going to be a moment or two later. The ideas don't go away. The work doesn't go away. It just gets put on pause, and we've become very good at then hitting the unpause button and picking up where we've left off. I used to be very scared that if I succumbed to those distractions, that the whole process would fall apart, and it doesn't have to. It is just a matter of putting things on pause. Not only do I trust myself, but I trust the other dancers with that aspect as well. And again, that has come from over time being together and proving to each other that we can take a moment, step back, and step right back into it. I think that speaks to our professionalism, but it also speaks to us as parents and as people, that we can, if I forgive the moment, they will forgive the moment. If they forgive the moment, I will forgive the moment.
Right.
And now it's not even a question.
Well, interestingly, my second and third questions now will be a bit of follow-up to what you said. One being, as adept as you have become at dealing with it, when it does happen and it is particularly difficult, how does it impact your work, and how are you able to regain your focus?
Yes, so on the much more difficult days, I think, kind of like I said, there is this notion that if you become so distracted, the process, at least for the day, can fall apart. And I think I've been there. I've definitely been there, where I need I need to stop, I need to break because the distractions were too much, and I don't want to say I then let the process fall apart, but I chose to say, hey, look, this is too much. So let's stop, let's shift to something else, someone else take over, someone else choreograph, or let's break for food, let's break for conversation, anything. Let's just, and we need permission to do that too. We have to be real.
Yes.
We can't just happily, merrily plow along without acknowledging that it does get really hard sometimes. And I think that's true for any artistic venture, any professional rehearsal.
Sure.
There are the moments where you just reach a breaking point and need a moment. And those certainly come, and those certainly came more frequently. Regaining focus, I think by taking that breath, taking that time, acknowledging, sometimes it's so built up in you personally, and then what would help is if I just then turned to Mandy or Lori or you and said, I'm so sorry, I'm so frustrated right now. And inevitably one of you would just go, hey, it's fine. Of course you're frustrated, it's frustrating. And just that acknowledgement would then be enough for me to go, oh, okay, I'm not crazy, I'm not deficient. Let's just handle the issue and okay, I can get back on track. So I think being brutally honest and again, that comes with the rapport that we've built and that we have with each other and the types of people we are. We've learned we can be brutally honest about those moments, and it's fine and it's good.
And as we referred to earlier, how we react at any given moment on any given day to even the same stimulus could be different. I'm wondering what kinds of contextual dynamics could impact the way in which you take that in and react on any given day. For example, how you felt coming into the studio.
Right. Well, I
day.
think whatever else is going on in our lives is going to affect that. Whatever, if these distractions are involving the children, what other arguments have you had with your children that day, or successes or failures in your relationship with your children that day have come up. Sometimes it's the first little poke they give you, and so it's fine. But if it's the 10th they've given you that day, you might blow up. It might happen.
Yes.
And that's all normal, but it's not normal to combine that with a rehearsal process necessarily.
Right.
And again, the fact that we're all in that same boat is certainly what makes it okay.
Right. Exactly. Well, earlier you also mentioned that when Lorena and Mandy had run through Brittle Branches, they hadn't rehearsed it in about a month, and they felt pretty good about how they did.
Right.
And in fact, that led Mandy to begin a little conversation with Lorena to say, or I should back up and say that Jonathan underscored their sentiments by saying, yeah, you both did a really terrific job, especially since you haven't rehearsed in a month. And it really struck Mandy and Lorena because their feeling is that it isn't very often that they get that kind of positive feedback and reinforcement. They just seem to have to be able to generate it for themselves. And that led me to wonder, do you think that this reluctance to praise is something that permeates the dance world? And if so, why?
That's a great question. I would say it permeates the dance world. It's not 100%. I think I've been very fortunate with a lot of the companies and choreographers who I've danced for that they've generally been supportive. But you know, it's almost stereotypically true that it's not a supportive environment. You know, any movie you see about dance, there's going to be the like director like and the dancers being like all sad because of all the critique they're getting and all the concerns they have about themselves. And to some degree, it's I don't know if negative reinforcement is at all necessary. I believe it is not. I think there's a lot of brutal honesty that is actually good. You need brutal honesty if you're really trying to push yourself to a professional level. But you also do need a lot of positive reinforcement. And I believe, and the environment I try to foster is one that is positive. Honest, but ultimately positive. Now, I've also been in situations where there's sort of where it's like too positive. It's like gushingly positive, and everything gets this, and I think it's a backlash from that. That we get this very serious tone in a lot of rehearsals because it is about creating the work. It's not about any one individual's ego. If they happen to do well in that moment, great. Can you do it again? Can you do it again? Will you be able to do it in the show? You know, it's like so it's not about the. It's not you don't want to do it for the praise. You want to do it because you want to become good at it. And I think there's also this notion that either the director or the choreographer, for example, whoever's leading the rehearsal, they are very focused on doing what's best for the piece. The piece comes first. I think that's a sentiment in most dance rehearsals, is that the piece comes first. So any one person's accomplishment, great, okay, maybe we take a moment to acknowledge it, but we don't have time to gush. We have to immediately move on to the next thing that we're trying to perfect, that we're trying to hone, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And you always want to be searching for that next thing that you can work on. The director might say, someone might do a great thing, but then they're immediately looking at the next person, their concentration is 360.
Right. Right.
And so while one person over here might do something terrible or amazing that deserves some attention and focus, the directors saw that, but he also saw 10 other things. So we have to keep things calm, focused on the work.
Would you say, John, that what you just described to us is an accurate representation of your personal approach in this realm?
I think so. I think that focus on the piece coming first is certainly true. But as you use the word underscore, I try to underscore how I further the piece with positive statements, with positive reinforcement. In my dance career, I've worked with many, many directors and have tried to learn what style fits me best in terms of directing and what is the most effective. And I've found that if you can find a way to state what to do as opposed to what not to do, you get a much better result. Even if you say, hey, I don't want you to do this, you try to then insert what you want them to do. There certainly are the directors that just scream and yell, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. Okay, but what you wind up doing is just cutting off avenues for people to explore. They go, okay, well, I can't go down that road with what I'm trying to do, but then where else do I go? You're not given a direction to go in. You just know not to go over there. But what of the 10,000 other avenues do you want me to go down? So again, I think stating things positively, keeping the morale up, those are very important.
Well, speaking of morale, actually, when the run-throughs of Brittle Branches had concluded and a quick food break was thrown in the mix, John, you put on video footage that your good friend had taken in HD of the March 18th showing. And during the particular rehearsal on the 25th, we watched Lorena's piece, Voices, sections 1, 2, and 5. And another question I've had in my mind for some time popped up as we were all watching the replay of these performances. And that is that I know a lot of people in the performing arts, interestingly, don't like to watch themselves on film or video in their performances. So, John, can you describe your experience of watching yourself on film?
Do I have to? I tend to not enjoy watching myself on film. I'm just so bleeping critical, and that applies to myself. Part of that is again, often I'm watching myself in my own choreography at this point, so there's so much to critique. I'm critiquing my choreographic choices, I'm critiquing my performing choices, I'm critiquing my preparation choices as to, maybe I should have done more of this before the show, or that, do I really like what I'm wearing? Or is it just the lighting of the video? What's going on? There's just so much. I have watched myself on video and been pleased. That has happened in my lifetime, but it's not the norm. Right. I think those happier times can come when there's been more space. If I wait 6 months or a year or 10 years to watch a video, I'm much more forgiving.
Right.
Because often then the piece isn't fresh in my mind, so I'm watching it almost anew, and I'm able to appreciate it for what it is, not what I'm trying to make it.
Exactly.
And certainly, and if it's 10 years, then I can appreciate how young I look, and oh, look how in shape I was, and then I'm pleased by those things.
Thinking back again for a moment to the Brittle Branches run through, you had mentioned to me a little while after that it occurred that moving forward with this piece in particular, that you wanted to focus on tracing the emotional arcs of the piece to indicate where the changes in emotional dynamics should take place. Do you think that working with those emotional nuances is something that generally occurs near the end of the process? Is that one of the last qualitative details to really be addressed and set in stone?
I've noticed that my tendency is to leave those details to the end. What's interesting is that I myself am thinking about them from the very beginning, but I don't always talk about it until closer to the end of the process. I have some theories as to why that is, which maybe I'll get to, but I just wanted to add before I do that I don't think there's one formula.
Okay.
It depends on it certainly depends on the choreographer and what their process is, but for me it depends on the piece. It depends on the dancer. I think in terms of qualitative details, there's the skeleton of the piece, but then there are these the gestural nuances, the lines of the body. There's the where things occur in space. All of those things matter. And then there's the emotion that the dancers are bringing to the piece, and there's the intellectual sort of acting subtext that can be brought to the piece. All of those layers, at least in my work, I want to address in the rehearsal process so that they all get brought to the stage. But I don't necessarily think it matters what order they are addressed in, as long as all the layers get put in. That said, like I said, I do think about the emotional arc of a dance towards the beginning and throughout, but I don't always talk about it with the dancers, partly because sometimes I don't have the exact arc mapped out A to Z right away, but I'm thinking about it. And so I don't necessarily want to have the dancer commit to one direction and then change it up and change it up and change it up. So I kind of want myself to get it fleshed out and then ask the dancer to really bring it forward and say, okay, now in the beginning you're happy and then you're going to get sad, but then things are going to be okay, and in the end you laugh, whatever it is. I want to be a little bit more prepared before I really deliver that information concretely. I also don't want, and this has been some, in my experience, in my wizened experience, I don't want a commitment to the acting or the performance or the emotional portrayal of movement to influence my choreographic choices, if this makes sense.
Yes, can you explain that?
Yeah. So, for example, I've discovered that sometimes I will give a dancer a movement. Let's say it's at the beginning of the dance, and I'll say, oh, and this is coming from a tragic moment, and they may be very good performers who then immediately infuse it with this tragedy, and that tragedy comes across so well because of their acting, and I'm happy and I move on without really analyzing, have I choreographed it? Have I given them the right movement to convey that, or did they just imbibe what I've, this generic step that I've given them? Were they able to infuse it with this great performance, which is wonderful if they can do that? But I really want to make sure that the details, the gesture, the lines, again, all of those things I mentioned, that I've done my work to make it truly a tragic step, a tragic movement. And then when the dancer infuses it with their meaning, it's so much more powerful, and it leads much more interestingly into the next thing. So I almost don't want them to do the work for me too soon.
Interesting.
If that makes sense.
Sure. Well, I think we have time for a couple more. There's so many dynamics in the course of every single rehearsal. We literally could spend hours delving into it. I did want to mention one observation in terms of how external dynamics can shape the development of an artistic process. And I think something that did occur in this particular rehearsal was a great example of that, which is that, as we mentioned earlier, Lorena had a very, very long commute as a result of having moved to a new home, and she was very concerned that if the commute was this long, it would prevent her from continuing her work with Second Story. Now that's a really big deal, as you know. And everyone really rallied around her to brainstorm, well, how could we think about this differently to accommodate this new change for Lorena, but still make it workable for Jonathan and Mandy. And one of the ideas that was floated is something that we are going to try subsequently, which is to start rehearsal later and end rehearsal later. And of course, that has all kinds of implications as well for each of the dancers. But here is a great example of the trajectory of the process being significantly impacted by an external type of dynamic. And you will hear us speak about many of these as we move forward. Finally today, I wanted to pose a question to John with regard to the creation of new material, because toward the end of the session, you were playing around with two different versions of the choreography that you had begun the week before, right, and you had started to expand upon in this particular rehearsal. And you came up with a solution, actually, to something that you had found vexing, and you were kind of working it through. You told me that you had created what you called approximately 2 eighths worth of material. And when I asked John at the time, is that a lot of material? And he said, no. And in discussing it further, I realized that, once again, the nature of our Second Story environment, where we have to create while caregiving, is such that the amount of work that we can get done is necessarily limited by the dynamics involving the children, most of which we can't predict in advance. So given the fact that it appears that what you're able to create is either a little bit or significantly less than what you were used to being able to create in your professional life pre-children, do you then wind up evaluating your work and assessing your progress differently, knowing that this is the context within which you're working?
Yes, I have to. Like I said earlier, in the beginning, it was very tough. It was very frustrating to only be able to make a tiny portion of a piece on any given day. And sometimes it wouldn't be, and it's not like then the next week I'd make another tiny piece. Sometimes I'd have to go back and change that first tiny piece, and sometimes it would just be weeks before I'd get to make the next little piece. It's baby steps, and sometimes those baby steps are very spread out. I'm much more used to that pace right now. I'm actually in an odd way, and again, I don't know if I want to work this way for the rest of my life, but I'm starting to appreciate it. I feel like it's really forcing me to become very detailed and very considerate about those little pieces. I make a little piece and then I have weeks to think about it and kind of move through it in my kitchen and practice it here and there, and evolve it and develop it. So I believe each little morsel is richer because of that work. I think Brittle Branches is an example of that. It's a piece that is chock full. Each moment is chock full of design and nuance that I don't know if I would have made a piece quite so intricate if I was able to work faster through.
Interesting.
Maybe, but I haven't quite made one that intricate before, so it could have been a result of this process. I certainly feel that way about this new solo that I'm working on. That just those two or I now have 3 tiny little nuggets strung together, but I feel very good about each of them, and I feel like, oh, if I really, chew on each morsel, it's just going to be that much more digested when I need it to be.
We look forward to watching you chew on these morsels.
I have the teeth for it.
And the nice thing about it is that we'll be here each week with you to take you through the rehearsal, to take you through the process, in all of its permutations, both planned and unplanned. And we are delighted that you're joining us for the ride.
Yes.
And hope you will return for our 3rd videocast next week. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.